Hello and welcome to the British Food History Podcast. I am your host, Neil Buttery, food historian and chef. My guest today is historian Mark Truesdale, scholar of the 15th century king and commoner tradition and its early modern afterlife. This is a niche subject, sure, but I'm very excited about this one. I heard Mark speak at the Leeds Symposium of Food History and Traditions earlier this year, and I found his talk so interesting that I contacted him and invited him on the pod, and he very kindly agreed. Now, this is the last episode before the Serve It Forth Food History Festival, which is online and on Saturday, 18th of October. That's this week. Sam Bilton, Thomas Ntinas, Alessandra Pino and I are all very excited, and we're working very hard behind the scenes. My guest on the day is the fantastic Tom Parker Bowles. No, I don't know how I bagged him either. Now remember, you can still get a 25% discount off the ticket using the code SERVE25 at the checkout. Link is in the show notes. Season 9 of the British Food History Podcast is sponsored by Fruit Pig, Britain's last remaining commercial craft producer of fresh blood black puddings. Also available are their gluten-free black puddings, a decadent hog's pudding, and traditional haggis. They also make excellent bacon and sell some great British charcuterie. So please visit the website fruitpig.co.uk for more details of their products and journey. On there you can find your local stockist and access their shop. Fruit Pig, aka Grant Harper and Matthew Cockin, are very kindly giving listeners to the British Food History Podcast a unique special offer, 10% off your order until the end of October 2025. Use their offer code FOODHIS in the checkout. FOODHIS is FOODHIS, all one word, capital F. Please support them if you can. And they kicked the 9th season off, so please go back and check out that episode if you want to hear more about them. Right, let's get cracking. I am talking with Mark Truesdale, author of The King and Commoner Tradition, Carnivalesque Politics in Medieval and Early Modern Literature, published by Routledge. And we are talking about the king and commoner tales of the late Middle Ages. They were once very popular, but are now a rather little-known genre. But they tell us a lot about the politics of food at this time. The Routledge website says this: the medieval king and commoner tales depict an incognito king becoming lost in the forest and encountering a disgruntled commoner who complains of class oppression and poaches the king's deer. This is an upside-down world of tricksters, violence, and politicised feasting that critiques and deconstructs medieval hierarchy. The commoners of these tales utilise the inversion of the medieval carnival, crowning themselves as liminal mock kings in the forest while threatening to rend and devour a body politic that would oppress them. These tales are complex and ambiguous, reimagining the socio-political upheaval of the late medieval period. And food and feasting abound in these tales, and I'm most thankful that Mark spared the time to come on the podcast, bearing in mind he's a brand new dad and therefore somewhat sleep deprived. We talk about medieval carnival, spying foresters, rude monks, the love of eating tiny birds, who the audience might have been, and the ridiculousness of baking a venison pasty in Sherwood Forest, amongst many other things. Those listening to the Secret Podcast can hear about Henry VIII's love of Robin Hood tales, cowardly herons, and Mark tells me who the king in these tales may or may not be referring to. Okay, I'll be back at the end, but now please enjoy Subversive Feasting in Medieval King and Commoner Tales with Mark Truesdale. Welcome to the podcast, Mark. It's very exciting to speak with you today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Now, before we get started, could you tell listeners a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in this rather niche topic? We love niche topics on this podcast, by the way, so don't worry.
I first became very interested in the medieval Robin Hood texts when I was at university. Ended up doing a master's dissertation on them with Professor Stephen Knight, who's a big authority with the Robin Hood texts. I was just fascinated how these texts portrayed this comic medieval trickster, but at the same time seemed to challenge medieval orthodoxy, invert norms. So I was then looking around for other related texts that perhaps did that had been less studied. And Stephen Knight pointed me towards these King in Common or King in Disguise texts. And I ended up doing my PhD on these texts because there hadn't been any book about them. There hadn't even been a collection of all these tales. So I had to go through archives to find them all.
Right. I was wondering that because I was thinking, obviously, I didn't know anything about King and Common tales until I saw you speak about them and Robin Hood in general, I suppose, at the Food and Drink Symposium in York, called Leeds, but it's in York. It's very confusing. But it was one of the things I was wondering, if you were speaking at a medieval conference or a history conference, perhaps, would you have to explain those other medievalists what one of those tales were? So they're quite obscure too.
Yes, I often had to. One of the reasons I ended up going for King, because even the name of the title of these texts is a bit uncertain. I ended up plumbing for King and Commoner, partially because whenever I went to medieval conferences especially, I'd talk about King in Disguise, and then I'd have lots of people saying afterwards, oh, what about this knight in disguise who runs mad to test his love, or this king infiltrates a camp in disguise, but none of them were related to the text that I was doing, which is very much about a disguised king encountering a commoner. But yeah, I became fascinated by them, and they have feasting very much at the core of them, this kind of politicized feast. So I became then fascinated by how it was using the food, what the food represented, and then kind of bringing that back to the Robin Hood texts, which are very closely related to these King Commoner texts. In fact, they kind of merged together at one point.
Well, I suppose we should start with the basics, really. Am I right? So these stories are all essentially poems, ballads. Is that correct? What is a ballad in this context?
It's an interesting one. The term ballad ends up encompassing quite a lot. So you have, say, in the early modern period, you have broadside ballads, which were printed and had little refrains, or hey, nonny, nonny, and see, that you have to say every few lines, and they'd say to this tune. The medieval ballads certainly are related to them in some way, but aren't quite the same. They were perhaps performed to music. We don't really know. But if you were trying to sing, say, the 1,000 lines of A Guest of Robin Hood to a simple tune, I think you'd end up being punched before you got halfway through by an irritated audience. But essentially, the medieval ballads, so-called, tend to be relatively short tales and simple rhyme schemes. They are often seen in relation to the lower classes or to minstrels. So they're kind of a simpler form than, say, medieval romance, which were these huge, or the medieval epics, which were these huge, vast texts and very complex, lots of poetical forms. These ballads, so-called, are far simpler, more rustic, perhaps seem to have come from oral culture a lot of the time.
Yes, they're certainly easy to understand, because even me with my terrible Middle English skills could decipher the majority of it without having to cross-reference. Not all of it, but short lines, things rhyming helps with understanding, especially with some familiar words and working out how they might be pronounced and things like that. So, yes. So that's the form it's written in. What about the King and Commoner tale? Is there a standard format?
There is a standard plot, and there are a couple of little hints at earlier tales. The most famous being King Alfred fleeing a battle, meeting a swineherd and his wife, and then he's told to watch the cakes and they accidentally burn.
Of course, yes.
There are a couple of later ones recorded by Walter Map and Gerald of Wales in around the 12th, 13th century, but most of the tales, and the tales that I'll be talking about now, all survive from the 15th century, so the very end of the medieval era, and that's where this form, the narrative structure, really seems to get set in stone. They all seem to draw on a very similar structure. So they all start with a king going out hunting and becoming lost in the forest and separated from his followers. you sometimes get this in medieval romance, and they'd normally discover a quest or a fantastical beast. Instead, he comes across a disgruntled rustic commoner who has various complaints about the king and his court. In King Edward and the Shepherd, King Edward comes across Adam the Shepherd, and he talks about how the king's men have robbed him. He says, I must flee from my wanning, my home. Therefore, woe is me. I had cattle, now have I none. They take my beasts and down them slawn and paying but a stick of tree. They've killed his beasts and have given him just a tally stick in return for it. Right. In John the Reeve, John talks about the king's statutes that are oppressing him. Say, as a result of the king's statutes, he's forced to eat salt bacon of a year old and drink ale that is both sour and cold. For I dare not eat that I get, thereof I am fuller off. For he that first starveth John the Reeve, I pray to God he may never well prosper, neither on water nor land. Whether it be sheriff or king that makes such a statuing, I accept never a one. I don't accept any of them. Which is quite a statement in the medieval period. Adam the Shepherd also complains about the foresters. He says, wood has ears, field has sight. This idea of being constantly watched. There's a Scottish tale as well called Roif Collier, in which Roif the Collier, the charcoal burner, talks about the menacing foresters that have all at annoy for dread of the deer. So the forestry laws really come into it. And if you notice on all of these, there's an emphasis on food and livestock as well that are being taken from the commons or being denied to them. I said, John the Reeve says, I dare not eat that I get. He dares not eat that he can get. He's forced to sell it on under the laws. So, this all then sets the stage for the feast. So the commoner brings his unknown guest back home and then presents a feast for him. And it has a very distinctive structure that is almost always followed. So the commoner first brings out food fairly appropriate to his class. However, as the texts say, thereof he would not let, and then brings out a vast array of birds such as pheasants and crane and heron, curlews, all to the great astonishment of the king. Adam the Shepherd says, this is meat that were worthy for a great lord. And if you look at studies like Chris Woolgar's study of great households in the Middle Ages, that's true. This is already the type of feast that would be reserved for the lord's mess alone. And certainly wouldn't be had by a commoner.
Especially all those tiny little birds, because you require falcons, etc., to catch them, and only the higher echelons can have those. And then even within that small band, there's a very strict hierarchy, isn't there, as to what type of bird of prey you're allowed to own. So, it doesn't get fancier.
But then the feast does get fancier still, because then suddenly the commoner brings out venison and sometimes swans. And these are, amid the emphasis that he's in the royal forest, these are poached. And when I say poached, I don't mean boiled. I mean, no. Whenever I say poached, take it for granted, I mean stolen from the king's forest, taken, killed illegally. So these are poached from the king's forest. This is meat that's reserved for the king alone, that not even lords are allowed to take without his express permission. And here's the commoner reaching for it. So you can see this feast going through the hierarchies. It kind of starts with the commoner's food, then goes up to the lord's food, and then reaches all the way up to the king's own table. And in this feast, then the commoner often starts to behave almost kind of like a king ordering his guest. Or in John the Reeve, John says he will offer golden fee to his guest if he'll marry his daughter and pledge his allegiance to him. In Roif the Collier, Roif the charcoal burner, he ends up punching the king across the room for refusing to obey his demands and being an uncouth guest.
Bit rich, isn't it?
So he's suddenly, by grasping this food, commoners suddenly seem able to command the king and seem to be this kind of mock king of their own little world. But these tales then end with a second feast at the court. The commoner, not knowing who he is, invites the commoner back to visit him at court. At the court, the king then puts on another feast, reveals his true identity, and usually then rewards the commoner in some way.
Right.
Which sounds kind of straightforward, and yet there's often a strange atmosphere in these court scenes. There's often an emphasis on the commoner's psychological torture, on images of execution, on hempen cords. And even after he's rewarded, the commoner often seems rather upset. How I interpret this is perhaps in the forest, the commoner was kind of escaping hierarchy briefly, but once he's been rewarded by the king, always as part of it, he has to swear he will never poach again. He will live within his own class now. He will just be a commoner fixed beneath the king again. But either way, there's this strange thing created by these texts where the forest is always this place of life and feasting and joy and inversion, and the court's always a place of oppression and death, it seems, in these texts, which is very unusual. Of course, you wouldn't be able to outright criticize the king, even in these texts. Kind of, it's always a historical king, it's always a king from the distant past. But even so, you couldn't criticize a king directly. So I wonder if there's perhaps trying to make sure that these texts are permissible and are not treasonous, and yet also voicing these anxieties perhaps beneath it.
Well, I was going to ask about that actually, because maybe we just need to take a little look at the sort of historical context that all of these are written, and it's very important in this case in the late medieval period, because there's as you've called it, aristocratic anxiety, really, about suddenly the ways that society is structured, has been structured for a long time, is suddenly potentially not stable because of the Black Death. Is that right?
Yes. There's such a worker shortage that the commoners start to gain more rights, more freedoms. They're able to ask more in terms of payment. They start being able to escape from feudalism where they have to be fixed in a single place and start moving around more. And by the end of the 14th century, of course, you have the peasant revolts as well, with what's they called peasant revolt. There's the 1381 one, there's 1450, there's some other little ones around the time as well. And what's often being voiced is demands for more freedoms, more rights from these oppressive laws, because the aristocrats seem to react to these freedoms by issuing more laws, like the sumptuary laws, which expressly kind of said the commoner must look like a commoner. They were only allowed to buy this kind of cloth, wear this kind of thing, have this kind of wage, trying to refix feudalism. But they kept reissuing them, so it clearly wasn't working. And yes, by the 1381 revolt, one of the quotes I found most interesting, certainly for these King and Commoner tales, is a speech John Bull was alleged to have given on the eve of the 1381 rebellion, which really focuses on food as part of this oppression. Kind of says, "Are ye good people? The matters goeth not well to pass in England, nor shall not do till everything be common, and that there be no villains or gentlemen," that's commoners or gentlemen, "but that would be all united together, and that the lords be no greater masters than we be. They have their wines and spices and good bread, and we have the drawing out of the chaff and drink water." So as part of this demand for a kind of more equal society, an abolishment of commoners and aristocrats altogether, everyone being equal, which is kind of proto-communist almost. You have this real emphasis on food, of equal access to food.
So it seems like these tales could be quite dangerous. It's almost inciting these sort of anti-feudal behaviours, I suppose you could call them. I was wondering who's listening to these tales? What's the audience? Or who is the audience, should I say? Do you think?
It's very difficult to really know. I mean, this is a debate that's gone back and forth for decades in Robin Hood studies as to who was reading them. And these King Commoner tales and Robin Hood tales are often recorded in very similar manuscript collections, little miscellanies. The consensus seems to be settling on, through the work of Thomas Olgren especially, that it was being read by this newly rising mercantile class, though. So this rising middle class, this class breaking with the feudalistic restraints, who are able to gain more money and more influence and more power. It seems like these people were perhaps reading more, or certainly were perhaps writing it down more, because of course there's also literacy comes into this as well.
Yes.
Literacy starts to rise amongst the commoner new middle classes, yeoman classes. which is perhaps why the Robin Hood tales and these King Come tales all start to be recorded at the same time in the 15th century. We get this kind of rise in this new class. So if it is being read by them, it's no surprise that it's therefore reflecting some of these concerns, some of these breaks with feudalism, the power centres shifting from the aristocrats to this kind of new yeoman mercantile centre. We've only got, of course, the texts that have survived to us as perhaps a bit random. We don't really know fully what was out there and what had been read by whom. Very strong possibility different classes experience Robin Hood in different ways.
Now, this setup that you've described of the king being lost in the forest, the meal essentially being inverted, is a carnivalesque scenario, and that's very important, isn't
Yes.
it? Because we should say maybe describe what you mean by that, because people might be thinking of a carnival in a rather modern context rather than a medieval one.
There were two main periods of carnival and inversion in the medieval period. One was around Christmas and the New Year, and the other was around the May festivities. And around Christmas and the New Year, there are records of people pretending to, say, worship demons or disrupt church services by dressing in fantastical costumes, flinging mud at each other during the service.
Right.
Or burning dung rather than incense. While the clergy themselves, there are records of them sometimes dressing up in lay clothes or electing a mock abbot or a boy bishop to lead a kind of nonsense service. There was also the Feast of Fools, led by the Lord of Misrule or Bean King. This was usually someone someone of a lower status who was chosen to lead the feast. So yeah, there was this sense of someone of lower status being able to lead and church services being turned on their heads. And this itself seems to perhaps go back all the way back, or at least closely parallel, the ancient Roman winter festival Saturnalia, which was also a feast held where normal order was inverted. Someone of lower rank was meant to lead the feast, or servants meant to lead the feast. There's this idea of the world turned upside down, which is also a very common trope in medieval literature.
And the way I've kind of understood that from what I've read is, because it sounds like, you're giving people the benefits of freedom for a short period.
Yes.
You might be giving them ideas to want to do this all year round, but it seems that also by making it slightly ridiculous, it's saying, but look at the chaos that would ensue if everybody just had equal footing, or if things were inverted. So actually, although it's maybe a claustrophobic life, it's actually the best life to lead.
It's interesting because there's lots of debate about whether it's a kind of a pressure valve to keep people contained and happy for the rest of the year, a little blowing off of steam, or whether it led to actual insurgent action. It seems to have been both in some weird way. There are definitely some records of festivities getting out of hand and people then holding up a road, blockading it and demanding death to the law official. There's one that's where I think they've been playing at Robin Hood and they say, "We are Robin Hood's men, war, war, war." So they could get out of hand sometimes. And some of the imagery was perhaps used by some of the rioters in the 1381 and 1450 rebellions too. The other festivity, of course, though, was the May Games. And this is particularly relevant to the Robin Hood ones. In the May Games and feasts would be similarly led by a summer lord or a mock king elected by the people. And in the 15th century, when the Robin Hood tales start to burst into popularity, several records show that rather than playing a nameless mock king, the person leading it started to play at being Robin Hood and getting a costume and dressing up as Robin Hood to lead these games and the feast. It's also perhaps where we get a couple of other characters from the Robin Hood tradition as well. In the medieval Morris, there was a man-woman, a man dressed as a woman, who was traditionally called the Maid Marian. And there was also a kind of mock friar as well, who would beat people about or behave in a very unholy way. And we have a Robin Hood play from one of these May Games, and it was just a fragment, but in it, Robin Hood fights a friar to a standstill, invites the friar to join his band, and then gives him a maiden to satisfy the friar's lust. And the friar then says, "I have a huckle-duckle an inch above the buckle," which was presumably some kind of wooden phallus or something he tied onto himself, and then dances with the maiden in the mire. So behaving in a very unholy way with fighting and then sex kind of all tied together. So yeah, as you can see how Robin Hood was very much tied up with these festivities, and how it perhaps, and with feasts also being at the centre of both the Christmas and May ones, you can perhaps see how this carnival atmosphere, this world turned upside down for a day, came into the King and Commoner tales, where you have this feast where the commoner is king for the day, and for the day able to boss about the king and claim his food for himself.
I wanted to quickly just ask you about Robin Hood and the monk, because you've written about it a little bit, because although it's not a king commoner tale, there's poaching, there's people who are eating things they shouldn't be eating.
Very closely related.
Rather than being a political story about kings and the aristocracy, this is about the church instead. So I guess it's having a go at the other major force in society.
Yes, Robin Hood and the monk has Robin Hood goes to Nottingham. He wants to hear mass, but a monk sees him there. A great-headed monk, we're told. He's a very big head, and Robin Hood has robbed him before. So he breaks the kind of sanctity of the church and kind of runs off to find the sheriff to bring him back to the church to arrest Robin during mass. Robin Hood is arrested. The other men, led by Little John, they lay siege to Nottingham. And they intercept the monk and his messenger who are going to the king with letters, kill them, and then take their identity, go to the king, get release papers for Robin, infiltrate the castle saying got permission to take Robin to the king and get him out that way. And they celebrate by having venison pasties.
Nice. Which are not like, people might be thinking of Cornish pasties or something. A medieval pasty is quite a splendid thing.
Well, there is actually a 15th century recipe for venison ye bake, which very much sounds like what they might have had. It says you take venison and parboil them in fair water and salt, and when the flesh is fair boiled, make a fair pastry, and cast the venison therein, and cast above it powdered pepper, ginger, and salt, and set it into the oven. Let bake and serve forth.
Yes.
So that's the kind of thing they perhaps had.
Yeah.
The pastry itself, I'm not an expert on this, but I believe it would have probably been a kind of a harder pastry than the flaky pastry we have today.
Yes, it probably wasn't eaten. Or if it was eaten, it was taken off by the almoners at the end of the meal to be distributed, to the peasantry or whatever. But yes, it's just a coating, and it's usually a really large cut of meat, like a haunch, that's being covered up with rye pastry. Apparently, the rye is resistant to cracking when you bake it. So when you bake a pasty, it's a way of preserving meat, basically. So you can bake your pasty. You might pour some boiling hot wine through the hole when it comes out, or maybe some butter to seal it. But the idea is you can take that off and keep that in a larder for a good sort of 6 weeks or so, if you do it properly, that is. I'm sure it went wrong many times.
Very good for food on the go then, for an outlaw band besieging a town.
Yeah. A venison pasty says a lot more than I think you might imagine. There's the venison itself, which is obviously very important and heavily restricted when it comes to anybody below the aristocracy. You've also got to be able to make some pastry. So that's making a shell out of some kind of cereal and not eating it. So you have to be able to afford to use something that you're not actually going to eat. Which again, the peasantry wouldn't be able to do that. And you've also got to have a massive oven to cook it in, which again... the peasantry aren't going to have either. So it's not just the fact that, there's some fancy meat here that they shouldn't be eating. It's actually several reasons why this is just absolutely outlandish.
Wonderful. I love that.
So, yes, I thought the venison pasties were quite interesting because it's just ridiculous.
Great way to celebrate a prison break.
Yeah, exactly.
By outlaws. The obsession with food in Robin Hood also continues into the Guest of Robin Hood. The Guest kind of abounds with images of food. There's a feast given by the corrupt abbot of St. Mary's to a impoverished knight that Robin Hood has helped, which ends criticising the abbot's greed or lack of hospitality and morality. There's a brilliant little scene in which a disguised Little John infiltrates the sheriff's household as a servant, and then ends up kind of waking up. The sheriff has gone out and he feels hungry, so he breaks into the kitchen to steal some food. the chef ends up kind of fighting with him, trying to keep the food that was put aside for the sheriff, and they have a little fight, and then they decide that they're both equal fellows. So they both run away to Robin Hood's band together and take the sheriff's food with them. So if the food and the person who creates the food ends up going from the sheriff's house to the forest. There's also a brief feast Robin Hood holds for an untruthful monk of St. Mary's who they capture after seizing the abbey's ill-gotten gold. But the main two feasts, one at the start and one at the end of the guest. And both of them also kind of tie into this idea of inversion and the carnivalesque. The one at the start of the guest has Robin refusing to eat his feast until he sees some adventure or hears a tale or has a guest brought to him, which is what King Arthur does in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Chretien's Percival. So it's very clearly parodying these romance tales. And then when you get to the feast itself, it is a kind of elevated, almost Arthurian royal feast. We're told, bread and wine they had enough, and numbles of the deer. Swans and pheasants they had full of good, and fowls of the river. There failed never so little a bird, there was ever bread on brer. So they had bread and wine enough, and sweetmeats of the deer. They had fine swans and pheasants and birds of the river. They lacked not even the smallest bird, there ever was bred on a briar.
Yeah, they love those little birds. Yeah.
And I've actually found another recipe, also in the same cookbook, for numbles of the venison. So that's numbles be all the offal, of course. It says to take the numbles of venison and cut them small while they been raw. Then take fresh broth, water and wine of each a quantity, and powder pepper and cinnamon, cannelle, and let them boil together till it be almost done, almost now. And then cast powdered ginger and a little vinegar and salt and season it up, and then serve it forth in the manner of a good pottage.
It's good. Again, it's a case where it's a pie, but it gives away the fact that they're not actually eating the pastry at the end of that recipe by saying it's served as a pottage, so you're just spooning out the contents.
Yes.
There's a theory that to eat humble pie comes from numbles. But I approach that one with caution.
More word association, perhaps.
Yeah. I wanted to ask a little bit about the meal, or the feast, sorry, the second feast that happens in these tales when the poor old commoner turns up still kind of confused sometimes as to why they might be there, or who maybe that stranger might have been. And then they realise, oh my God, what have I done? Which is quite an amusing part of the tale, I think. But they get away with it at the end of the day. In fact, they don't just get away with it, they usually get some benefits.
Yes. It's a strange end. In some ways, it makes sense. It's in theory a good end to the tale, even if I say there's perhaps some tensions going around in the air. But it is a comedy directed at the commoner as well. You often have all of these, I think in King Edward and the Shepherd, you have all of the lordings in the hall, on the herd they laugh and all. You have this wave of laughter all directed towards the commoner.
I see.
It is definitely an ending that can be interpreted in a variety of ways. You can either read them as a mocking the commoner bungling about in the King's Hall, and everyone becomes aware of what he's done, and the commoner is the only one that's unaware, and you have this wave of laughter directed to him. On the other hand, you can read it as you've had all of the commoner's complaints of the oppression by the court, and this is just that happening again to an extent. Him being mocked, not taken seriously, his complaints being dismissed, the oppressions against him being dismissed. And that involves theft. In King the Shepherd, it also actually involves rape of his daughter. And that's constantly brought up in those court scenes while they're laughing at him, which
it's
it
pretty
makes it very uneasy.
Yeah.
So, it is a strange ending. The second feast in the Guest of Robin Hood follows a king and commoner narrative. So a disguised King Edward comes to the north and discovers that all the deer in Plompton Park has been poached by Robin Hood. There's nothing left for him to hunt, and he's furious at this. He says he wants the head of a knight that's recently helped Robin, so you presume that death is awaiting Robin himself as well. But he can't find him. And then someone gives him an idea to dress up as in disguise as a monk, go into the forest, and he'll waylay you. And that's what he does. So he goes into the forest in disguise, gets waylaid by Robin Hood, and then Robin Hood gives him this feast of the deer that the king so wander off about not having. It also kind of ends happily again, in that the king's identity is revealed, and he says, I will forgive all of you, but only if you come to live with me and be my man. And that's what happens. There's a weird little bit in the middle when Robin then dresses up the king in Robin Hood's own livery, the outlaw livery, as though the king's joining his band then, and starts beating the king. And then all the peasantry, kind of seeing this huge band come out the woods, flee thinking the revolution has come. And the king is dead. But when they get to the court, it seems to settle down and Robin is under the king. And Robin can't cope. He says before in the tale he lives with this kind of comedic excess of generosity, just giving away his money, but it always comes back to him because, if a monk comes through with a big thing of gold and he says, this Virgin Mary who I prayed to has brought back my gold. Fantastic. But he can't live to those ideals anymore so he becomes broke. And he specifically says, I can't sleep and I can't eat or drink here. So food, again, being brought into it. And he ends up fleeing from the court against the king's wishes, kills one of the king's deer to feast on it, and then refuses to go back to the court, a dread of our king.
Right.
So, again, you have that kind of king and commoner weird dearth at court. If there's a carnival feasting in the forest, there's this kind of Lenten dearth at court. It's in place of death and starvation.
Is this an example really of saying, well, okay, it might superficially look great being a king or an aristo, but actually it's a cutthroat world. You're even more restricted than you are where you're living in this sort of liminal space of the forest where you're free to do whatever you want as long as you don't get caught. Which, of course, hopefully you won't be doing any of these things. But it's much freer, and when you it's just better for you to be there and not here in the court. Sort of propaganda almost.
I really get that sense from both the King Commoner text and especially the Robin Hood texts, where he does live to this kind of trickster excess in a way that's not really possible in the real world. The forest is this kind of strange, liminal space where he can have all of this excess of freedoms. And again, this is a time, when feudalism is just ending, when there's just becoming this new kind of escape and these new kind of freedoms for this yeoman, which Robin Hood is a yeoman in this text, is not a dispossessed noble.
I see.
So he's part of this new yeoman class. So he seems to embody these new freedoms, which the yeoman merchants themselves were perhaps living in the towns rather than the forest. But it kind of creates this wonderful fantasy land where anything is possible, where you can escape. In the early modern period, in the broadside ballads, the King and Commoner texts become increasingly conservative. So once they're printed under the control of the censor, kind of watching all these texts being printed, all of this inversion disappears. The feasting disappears as well as part of that. There's no more poached feasting. The king just goes incognito, visits the commoner, brings them back, reveals his identity, rewards him. The commoner remains of his class, never appears like a king, never grasps that which is above him.
All that edginess is just gone.
Yeah, it's usually just a fool character, which the king can mock. Then as it goes on, by the time you get to William of Orange, there are texts that seem to be specifically put out there, and it's all about him in the king and commoner role.
Right, okay.
So it starts to become royal propaganda. So these texts really morph over time and go from this inverting text with feasting, this challenging feasting at its heart, to these very socially conservative texts that are just royal propaganda for new monarchs.
It's time to wrap up. Actually, one thing before I wrap up. Is it easy to find transcriptions of these poems, these pieces online?
The medieval ones, they have become a lot easier to find thanks to the Teams Middle English Text Series, which is published by the Medieval Institute, West Michigan, at University of Kalamazoo. And a lot of these are still available online. They have their funding threatened at the moment, but hopefully
Right.
they will continue to be available online. And there is one called 10 Boards, Bourdes, edited by Melissa M. Furrow, which contains a lot of these King and Commoner texts. There's also another one in the same series called Sentimental and Humorous Romances, which has Rolf Collier in, which is the only one missing from there. With the Robin Hood texts, they have an entire collection of Robin Hood and other outlaw tales. So those help to get a lot of them out of there.
We should also mention that your book's available, The King and Commoner Tradition. I have it in my very hand.
Oh, wow. Fantastic.
Thank you very much for sparing the time to come and talk to me today. Shall let you get back to sleeping?
Yes. Looking after our 5-month-old.
5 months. No, good age though.
Yes, she's very sweet.
Again, thank you very much for sparing the time to talk to me. It's been really fascinating.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for inviting me on. It's been wonderful. I'll go and celebrate with a venison pasty.
Thank you very much, Mark. There are lots of links in the show notes to Mark's book, as well as an online article that he wrote about medieval Robin Hood tales. There are also links to the books Mark recommended, including Chris Walgarth's Studies of Great Households. I have that one ordered, and I'm looking forward to receiving it and reading it. Remember, Serve It Forth is on 18th of October this Saturday. I would love to see you all there. It's pretty much time to go. Please leave positive reviews and rate the podcast on your podcast app so that it can be discovered by more and more people. If you can, support the podcast and blog financially and donate a one-off virtual coffee or pint, or start up a monthly £3 subscription to receive access to the secret podcast. Go to britishfoodhistory.com and click on the Support the Blog and Podcast tab, where you can find out about all of the benefits of becoming a subscriber. Now, don't forget, I want your material for the upcoming postbag edition of the podcast, so drop me an email if you like, neil@britishfoodhistory.com. The mixing and sound engineering was done by Thomas Ntinas of the Delicious Legacy podcast. The wonderful Olia Hercules was his guest recently on a great episode about the food culture of Ukraine. Right, it's time for me to go. Until next time, cheerio.